It started as the kind of friendship that made other people a little envious. When neighbors and classmates were later asked what they remembered about Emily Parker and Rachel Monroe, most of them said the same thing: they were inseparable. If you saw one, you saw the other. They walked to school together, shared clothes, whispered secrets over the phone until late at night. It was easy to mistake them for sisters. Rachel had moved into the neighborhood in 2001, the summer before high school. She was 15, reserved, with a waterfall of auburn hair she often used as a shield. She was smart, careful with her words, the kind of girl who rarely drew attention to herself unless someone asked her to play the piano. Emily was different from the moment she opened her mouth. Loud, magnetic, a little reckless. She had a quick laugh and a confidence that pulled others in. The first time she spotted Rachel standing awkwardly by her locker, she didn't hesitate to strike up a conversation. From that day forward, they were bound together. Their home lives gave them even more reason to stick close. Emily's father worked grueling shifts at a factory. Her mother was often away on overnight nursing jobs. Rachel's father had walked out years before, leaving her mother to juggle bills and long hours. Both girls knew what it felt like to be left alone in houses that echoed with absence. Together, though, they filled that emptiness with each other's company. By junior year, they were the girls people noticed in the hallway. Not because they were the prettiest or the most popular, but because of how close they seemed, how often they leaned in and laughed over private jokes. Teachers sometimes commented on how they balanced each other. Rachel, steady and hardworking, the student who could ace chemistry without much effort. Emily, impulsive and free-spirited, quick to charm her way out of detention. What others didn't see was the growing tension beneath that balance. Jealousy doesn't announce itself in loud declarations. It begins quietly, with small comparisons that take root. Rachel hated how easily Emily could step into a room and claim it. Boys gravitated toward her. Adults forgave her mistakes. Rachel, no matter how hard she worked, always seemed to be standing slightly in Emily's shadow. For Emily, the reverse was true. She noticed Rachel's perfect grades, the way their music teacher praised her playing, the way she seemed to have a kind of discipline Emily couldn't match. Their bond was genuine, but so was the rivalry simmering beneath it. Still, they held on. Friendships like theirs are hard to let go of, even when they start to hurt. Emily gave Rachel confidence, pushing her to step out of her shyness. Rachel gave Emily grounding, someone who would listen when the world frustrated her. They didn't know how to function without each other. By the time they were 20, their lives had started to split into different paths. Rachel stayed close to home, enrolling in community college while working nights at a diner. She kept playing piano, booking small weddings and events, building a reputation in the area as someone worth listening to. Emily, restless and directionless, had tried a semester at a bigger university but failed most of her classes. She drifted from one job to another, eventually meeting a bartender she married in a small courthouse ceremony. Rachel was her maid of honor, holding her bouquet and cheering louder than anyone else. A year later, Rachel was also the one babysitting when Emily gave birth to her son. It was loyalty, but loyalty doesn't erase jealousy. As Rachel began to thrive in ways Emily couldn't, the cracks deepened. Rachel's piano wasn't just a hobby anymore. She was good enough to secure a steady lounge gig in Columbus, an hour's drive away, and she was starting to talk seriously about pursuing music full-time. Emily, meanwhile, was fighting with her husband, scraping by on part-time work and drowning in bills. When her husband finally walked out for good, leaving her with a toddler and overdue rent, Emily felt like her life had collapsed. That was the exact moment Rachel seemed to be rising. She had just been invited to audition for a program in New York. For someone like Rachel, who had never really believed she'd leave Ohio, it was monumental. She told Emily the news over coffee one afternoon, her hands trembling with excitement. She expected Emily to squeal, to hug her, to celebrate. Instead, Emily smiled in a way that looked more forced than real. She said the right things. "That's amazing. I'm so proud of you." But her voice was tight, like she was swallowing something sour. The truth was that Emily couldn't stand it. The thought of Rachel leaving, stepping into some bigger life while she remained stuck in the small town, burned like acid in her chest. She had built her world around being Rachel's anchor, the one person she always came back to. Without her, Emily imagined herself drifting into nothing. By the summer of 2009, Rachel's life was busy. She practiced constantly, sometimes skipping her usual Friday nights with Emily to rehearse with other musicians. Emily noticed. She showed up at Rachel's apartment unannounced one night, walking in on her laughing with two other pianists, wine glasses on the table, sheet music scattered across the floor. To Rachel, it was harmless. To Emily, it felt like betrayal. The next day she told her mother, "She doesn't need me anymore." Her mother dismissed it, but Emily couldn't shake the thought. Everything came to a head in October, when Rachel threw a small party to celebrate her upcoming trip to New York for auditions. It wasn't a wild gathering, just a handful of close friends, fellow musicians, and, of course, Emily. She arrived late, already tipsy, laughing too loudly and hugging Rachel with a force that seemed more desperate than joyful. All night, she drank and watched Rachel glow at the center of attention, her fingers flying across the piano keys as guests clapped and cheered. Emily sat in the corner, her smile growing thinner each time Rachel's name was praised. As the night wound down and the last of the guests left, Emily stayed behind. No one knows exactly what words were exchanged. Neighbors later reported hearing voices raised in anger, the sound of something heavy crashing, then silence. By morning, Rachel Monroe was gone. At first, it was easy for Emily to explain. She told friends she'd left the party before midnight, that Rachel hugged her goodbye and promised to text once she landed in New York. For weeks, people assumed Rachel had gone to chase her dream. But when her landlord entered her apartment a month later and found her suitcase still under the bed, her passport in the desk drawer, and her piano untouched, the story fell apart. A missing persons report was filed, flyers were printed, the local news covered the mystery. Police questioned everyone, including Emily, who cried on camera as she held Rachel's photo. "She was like my sister," she said. "I just want her to come home." What no one knew, not Rachel's family, not the police, not Emily's closest confidants, was that Rachel's body was already hidden. Not buried in a shallow grave or tossed into the river, but in a place no one would have thought to look. Emily, in her drunken rage that night, had dragged Rachel's lifeless body across the apartment floor. In a burst of panic and ingenuity, she remembered the upright piano in Rachel's living room. Its wooden base was wide and hollow, with enough space to conceal what she had done. She pried open the paneling and forced the body inside, covering the opening again as if nothing had changed. To anyone else, it was just a piano, standing silently in the corner, waiting for music. By the time Rachel's disappearance became a cold case, the truth was sitting in plain sight, sealed away in wood and strings. Emily carried on with her life, raising her son, crying on anniversaries of Rachel's disappearance, insisting to anyone who would listen that her best friend had simply vanished into thin air. The piano, heavy and silent, was eventually moved from Rachel's apartment into storage, and from there, its trail seemed to vanish. For the next 10 years, Emily lived with the secret of what she had done, the piano and its hidden truth haunting her every step. For the first few weeks after Rachel's disappearance, Emily lived in a haze of adrenaline and denial. She told herself over and over that what had happened was an accident, that she hadn't meant to kill her best friend, that if Rachel hadn't provoked her, none of it would have spiraled. She repeated those words like a prayer while sitting on her couch, rocking her toddler to sleep, listening to the sound of the refrigerator hum. In the daylight, She played the part of the grieving friend. She carried flyers around town, taped them to telephone poles, even stood with Rachel's mother outside the grocery store, passing them to strangers. At night, though, when the world went quiet, she replayed the sound of Rachel's head striking the edge of the piano, the way her body had gone limp in Emily's arms. The piano itself was the biggest problem, and Emily knew it. The morning after, with the shock still buzzing in her skull, she looked at the upright piano sitting in Rachel's living room, its polished wood gleaming in the faint light. She had shoved Rachel's body into the hollow base, covering it with panels that had been loose for years. No one had ever looked inside it, and she told herself no one ever would. Still, she couldn't leave it there forever. Over the next week, Emily returned to Rachel's apartment under the guise of helping to organize things in case Rachel came back. No one questioned her. She was Rachel's closest friend. She slowly began clearing signs of struggle, rearranging furniture, scrubbing at faint stains on the carpet. When the landlord eventually started talking about the rent being overdue and what to do with Rachel's belongings, Emily offered to help. She made sure the piano wasn't left behind as trash. Instead, she arranged for it to be moved into a storage unit on the edge of town, telling the landlord it was valuable and that Rachel's family might want it someday. The movers groaned under the weight of the instrument, joking about how heavy it was, but Emily laughed nervously and said nothing. Once it was tucked into storage, Emily felt a kind of grim relief. To the outside world, it was just a piece of furniture. To her, it was the coffin holding the truth. She signed the lease on the unit under Rachel's name, paid in cash for the first year, then figured out how to keep it current without drawing attention. Every time the bill came due, she scraped together the money, sometimes late, sometimes barely, but never letting it lapse. She couldn't risk the contents being auctioned off or opened by strangers. The investigation eventually ran dry. Detectives interviewed everyone who had been at the party that night, but there was no evidence of foul play. Rachel's suitcase, left untouched, suggested she hadn't left willingly, but there was no trace of her anywhere. The case was featured on local news, then gradually faded as new tragedies replaced it. For most people, Rachel became another unsolved mystery, a name on a missing persons list. For Emily, she became a ghost who never stopped whispering. In public, Emily leaned into the role of the heartbroken friend. She spoke kindly of Rachel, sometimes too kindly, painting their friendship as perfect and unshakable. She told Rachel's mother she was sure her daughter would come back. Every anniversary of the disappearance, she posted photos on social media, long paragraphs about how much she missed her. People praised her loyalty, admired her devotion, and told her she was strong for keeping Rachel's memory alive. She accepted their sympathy, though inside it felt like a performance she could never stop giving. Behind closed doors, she was haunted. The image of the piano gnawed at her, the thought of what lay hidden inside. Whenever she drove past the storage facility, her chest tightened. Sometimes she'd park outside the chain-link fence and just stare, convinced that someone would discover the truth at any moment. She dreamed of the piano, too, dreams where the lid slammed open and Rachel's body spilled out, her eyes open, her mouth forming the words, "You did this." For years, she tried to smother those fears by throwing herself into her role as a mother. Her son became her anchor. She convinced herself that she had done what she had to do, that if the truth came out she would lose him, and that thought alone was enough to keep her quiet. She told herself Rachel's life had been headed somewhere far away, and maybe in some twisted way it was better that she never left, better that she was still here, even if only as a secret in wood and strings. But secrets don't stay buried without consequences. Emily's drinking worsened. At first, it was just glasses of wine after her son went to bed, a way to silence the memories. By the 5th year, she was drinking before noon, showing up late to work, snapping at co-workers. Relationships crumbled. Friends drifted away. People whispered that Emily had never been the same since Rachel disappeared, as if grief had poisoned her. They didn't know the grief was guilt. Her son grew older, more perceptive. He noticed when his mother cried alone in the kitchen, when she locked herself in the bathroom for hours, when she snapped at him for asking about Rachel after hearing her name on a rerun of a true crime show. Emily covered her pain with lies. She told him Rachel was missing but probably happy somewhere else, maybe living in New York after all. She painted Rachel as a runaway success story, though the bitterness in her voice made the words sound hollow. By the 8th year, the cracks began to widen. The storage unit had become a burden she could barely manage. Fees increased, late notices piled up, and she had to pawn belongings just to keep the account current. Every time she stood at the counter with a sweaty wad of cash, she imagined the clerk looking at her suspiciously, wondering why this woman was so desperate to hang on to a dusty old piano. Sometimes she thought about getting rid of it entirely, setting it on fire, dumping it somewhere no one would ever look. But each plan carried too much risk. And each time she thought about opening it, about seeing Rachel's body again after so many years, her stomach flipped and her vision blurred. She started avoiding certain people, too. Rachel's mother still lived in town, still lit candles in her window every October, still begged the police to reopen the case. Emily couldn't bear to look her in the eye. On the rare occasions they crossed paths at the grocery store, Emily forced a hug, forced tears, then fled with her cart half full. Her lies became harder to maintain. Once, at a family gathering, her younger cousin joked about Rachel probably living it up in some big city, and Emily snapped so viciously that the room went silent. Another time, drunk at a bar, she blurted out to a stranger, "You don't know what I've done," before backtracking and laughing it off. The stranger shrugged, but Emily drove home shaking, certain that one day she'd slipped too far. By the 10th year, Emily was a shell of the girl she had once been. Her son was a teenager, embarrassed by her mood swings and her drinking, spending more nights at friends' houses than under her roof. Her jobs came and went. She owed money everywhere. And still, every month, she scraped together enough to keep that piano locked away. The anniversary of Rachel's disappearance loomed heavier that year. The local paper ran a short piece, quoting Rachel's mother, who said she still lit the candle, still believed her daughter would come home. Emily read the words 3 times, her hands trembling, tears burning her eyes. She told herself again that it had been an accident, that she hadn't meant it, that Rachel had pushed her too far. But in her heart she knew the truth, the jealousy, the anger, the decision to hide the body, all of it had been hers. She started to wonder if maybe the only way to free herself was to let the truth out. Not because she wanted to be punished, but because living with the silence felt worse than prison. She rehearsed confessions in her mind, picturing herself walking into the police station, saying the words out loud. But every time she thought about her son, about what it would do to him, she shut her mouth and poured another drink instead. The cracks were becoming too wide to hold. And all it would take was one slip, one wrong word, one curious glance inside an old piano, to bring everything crashing down. By the fall of 2019, 10 years had passed since the night Rachel Monroe disappeared. In that time, the world had moved on in ways Emily Parker could hardly comprehend. Friends had gotten married, moved away, started careers. Her own son had grown into a teenager, taller than her, restless and impatient with the woman who had once been his entire world. And yet, despite the forward march of everyone else's lives, Emily felt frozen in place, anchored to that one October night and to the piano that still sat in a storage unit at the edge of town. Her drinking was no longer a secret. She stumbled through jobs, lost apartments, and cycled through boyfriends who rarely lasted more than a few months. Her son had grown weary of her moods and broken promises. He spent most weekends at friends' houses, leaving Emily to drink alone on the sagging couch, TV flickering in the dark. In her quieter moments, she wondered if this was her punishment, to rot slowly, never caught but never free. Then came the notice that changed everything. The storage company had been bought by a larger chain, one that planned to raise fees and crack down on delinquent units. Emily had been behind on payments for months, juggling overdue bills and pawning off furniture just to scrape by. When she opened the envelope and read that her unit was scheduled for auction in 30 days unless she paid in full, her vision blurred and her chest tightened. She felt the room spin. That piano, the coffin of her secret, was about to be handed over to strangers. She panicked. She tried to borrow money from her mother, her sister, even an ex-boyfriend, but no one trusted her anymore. She thought about sneaking into the facility late at night and burning the piano herself, but the thought of opening it, of seeing Rachel again after all these years, made her stomach churn. She considered disappearing altogether, driving west until her car gave out. But where would she go? And what about her son? In the end, she did nothing. The deadline came, and with it, the locks on her unit were cut. The man who won the auction was a retired truck driver named Carl Jenkins, who spent his free time flipping old furniture. He brought his nephew along to haul out the bigger pieces. When they slid the piano into the light for the first time in a decade, they noticed the weight immediately. "Feels like there's bricks inside," the nephew joked, grunting as they maneuvered it onto a dolly. Carl nodded, thinking maybe the bass was filled with old sheet music or records. They pushed it into the back of his pickup, tied it down, and drove it home. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when Carl began inspecting the piano for repairs, that he noticed something off. The paneling at the bottom had been tampered with. Nails bent at odd angles, wood scraped where it had been pried open. Curious, he wedged a crowbar into the seam and pulled. The smell hit him first. He stumbled back, gagging, as the panel fell open. His nephew, pale and wide-eyed, leaned in just enough to see before bolting for the yard. Inside the hollow base lay what remained of a body, shriveled by time but unmistakably human. The police were called within minutes. Sirens filled the quiet street, neighbors spilling onto porches to watch as officers taped off the yard. The piano, once just an instrument, was now evidence. By the next morning, every news station in Ohio was reporting the discovery of human remains hidden inside. And before the week was out, dental records confirmed what many had already suspected. The body was Rachel Monroe. The revelation rippled through the town like a shockwave. For 10 years, people had whispered theories about Rachel's disappearance. Some said she'd run away to New York, others that she'd been kidnapped, maybe even killed by a stranger. The truth was more grotesque and more intimate than anyone had imagined. For Emily, the news spread like wildfire she couldn't outrun. She woke to frantic phone calls, her mother's voice trembling through the receiver. She sat frozen on her couch, watching her television screen as Rachel's smiling photo appeared next to the headline, "Remains of missing woman found inside piano." Her first instinct was to deny. She told herself no one could connect it to her. But deep down, she knew the clock had run out. She had been the last person to see Rachel alive. She had been at the party. And the storage unit, though listed under Rachel's name, had been paid for in cash for years by someone who looked an awful lot like Emily Parker. The detectives knocked on her door 3 days later. She invited them in, her hands trembling as she lit a cigarette. They asked routine questions at first, but she could feel the noose tightening with every word. Where had she been the night Rachel disappeared? Why had she helped move the piano? How had the storage bills been paid all these years? She tried to keep her story straight, but her voice cracked, her eyes darted, and the detectives noticed. When they left, promising to stay in touch, she collapsed against the door and wept. She thought about running, but where would she go? The truth had already surfaced, and she was drowning in it. Her son found her that night sitting in the kitchen, a half-empty bottle of vodka on the table, tears streaking her face. For years, she had lied to him, painting Rachel as a woman who had simply disappeared, maybe even chosen a better life somewhere else. Now he stared at her with suspicion, his voice shaking as he asked, "Mom, did you know?" She tried to deny it, but the look in his eyes told her he didn't believe her. She had lost him long before the police ever arrested her. The formal charges came 2 weeks later: second-degree murder, evidence tampering, abuse of a corpse. The town that had once pitied her now turned on her with venom. Newspapers ran side-by-side photos of Emily and Rachel, headlines framing the story as one of jealousy turned deadly. Former friends told reporters about Emily's drinking, her short temper, the way she had always seemed overshadowed by Rachel. Everyone had a theory, everyone a memory that now felt like a clue they should have noticed sooner. The trial was a spectacle. Rachel's family sat in the front row every day, clutching tissues, listening to prosecutors describe how Emily had killed their daughter and stuffed her into a piano. Emily sat at the defense table, her once bright hair now dull, her face drawn, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. She whispered with her lawyer but rarely looked at the jury. The prosecution painted a picture of envy festering over years, culminating in rage on the night of the party. They described Emily dragging Rachel's body across the floor, hiding it in the piano, then maintaining the lie for a decade while pretending to grieve. The defense argued it had been an accident, a drunken fight gone too far, not premeditated murder. They begged for leniency, insisting Emily had been consumed with guilt ever since. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. The foreman stood and read the verdict: guilty on all counts. Emily closed her eyes as the words sank in. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging what she had known all along, that the truth, buried for so long, had finally clawed its way to the surface. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Her son refused to attend the sentencing, telling relatives he couldn't bear to see her. Rachel's mother, though, was there. She stood when the judge announced the sentence, her face pale but resolute. Later, outside the courthouse, reporters asked her how she felt. She said only, "My daughter finally has justice. That's all I ever wanted." In prison, Emily adjusted to a life stripped of freedom, stripped of the performances she had played for so long. Some inmates treated her with fascination, drawn to the sensational nature of her crime. Others shunned her. She spent most of her time alone, reading books from the library, writing letters her son never answered. She dreamed of Rachel almost every night, her voice echoing in the silence, asking why. The piano, the vessel of her crime, was destroyed. The wood was burned, the keys salvaged for evidence but never used again. For Rachel's family, it was a grotesque reminder they never wanted to see again. For Emily, it was the end of the lie she had built her life around. Years later, when people in the town told the story of Rachel Monroe, they spoke of her talent, her laughter, her music that had once filled small rooms with light. They spoke of the tragic end, of a friend who had turned into her killer. And though Emily's name was always part of the story, it was Rachel they remembered most. In the end, that was Emily's greatest punishment. Not the prison bars, not the trial, not even the years of guilt she carried. It was knowing that she would be remembered not as a mother or a friend, but as the jealous woman who killed the person she claimed to love most. And it was knowing that Rachel, silenced for a decade inside a piano, would finally sing louder in memory than Emily ever could in life.